Hello and welcome again to another episode of Water Cooler Conversations. Today's episode, I'm joined by Natasha Hall, who is currently working with Refugee International, as well as being an associate fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Natasha, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Mohammed.
So it's been a while. I think where we had originally intersected in terms of our work was focusing on water security issues and particularly water security issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. Obviously I'm going to pull on a lot of the sort of water topics that is of interest to both of us. Um, but I also know of several areas that you're involved in heavily and throughout your career. And I thought maybe we'd start a little bit earlier. I tend to jump around when I have these conversations with our guests, but your sort of original or early start in your career was really focused a lot on sort of humanitarian side of things. I do recall a lot of your work was centered on Syria, obviously during the time frame of sort of the unstable period during Syria's last decade or so with the civil war and all sort of the conflict and instability that unfortunately Syria was experiencing during that time frame. Talk to me a little bit about how you started down that path. I mean, sort of your trajectory from maybe your academic career and just deciding that's maybe sometimes maybe not a decision, maybe your calling finds you, but how did you start there in terms of that being one of the areas that you kind of developed your career in?
Again, thanks for having me. I mean, I am, and this actually probably speaks to the water security element as well. And you wouldn't know with my last name being Hall, but I am Jordanian by background, which is one of the most water impoverished countries in the world. And so water was always kind of in the background for me, as was conflict and displacement. Not because conflict was happening necessarily in Jordan, as it was in Syria and some of the surrounding countries, but because it was sort of the consequences of conflict, right? It was always suffering from sort of refugee crises, which would also affect the water security or insecurity of the country. So there was that aspect that I think drew me in. And then, to be honest, in the first couple of weeks and I'm going to be aging myself now, but of my undergraduate, I had no idea what I wanted to do. 9/11 happened by the second week. And I think for a lot of people, that brought them into the region on maybe more of the offensive side, let's say, diplomatically. For me, I realized what was coming and I wanted to be in the room in the sort of the more defensive slash nuanced department, maybe of conversations. So ever since then, I've been working primarily in conflict affected places, primarily in the Middle East, but I've also worked in about 15 different countries worldwide. So as I was working with refugees in places like East Africa and Asia and the Middle East for the US government, the Syrian war was kicking off. And this was a place that, interestingly enough, I was living in 2010. And my work was supposed to be on investigating displacement from the drought that was happening in the years preceding that. Um, and interestingly, and hopefully we can get into this, it was very difficult to do that research. No one wanted to talk to me because it was extremely sensitive. I distinctly remember being in an office in the Ministry of Water at that time, talking to someone who was with GIZ, which is a German development agency that works a lot on water in the Middle East. And the consultant basically, I told her what my research was, and she said, and I quote, "Good luck getting anyone to talk to you about that," which I think shows you how really securitized this conversation has been about water, why it's part of conflict increasingly, and why it's exacerbated by conflict as well. So as we all know, the war started, couldn't go back to Syria. But I did want to begin to refocus on Syria as time went on. So I left that job with the government and I moved to the region and I worked with organizations like the White Helmets, who do a lot of search and rescue work. That's what they're famous for. But they also did a lot of disaster risk reduction preparedness stuff. And so I worked quite a bit with them on that. But interestingly, and this is, I guess, where our paths meet, I got back to sort of environmental issues and water security, even though it was kind of permeating through different aspects of my career beforehand, because it's part of everything, right? It's part of humanitarian efforts, development efforts. You need water to survive. So I've started working on it a lot more as an analyst once I got to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it was only then that I kind of realized how much it made sense for me personally, because my mother was from Jordan, this very water impoverished place where, I grew up to really appreciate water. And my father worked for the EPA for pretty much all of his career as a marine biologist and water conservationist. So
You
it's
had to pick this career. It would have been a disappointment
right.
if you didn't.
Right. So all paths lead to Rome. So yeah, so that's a long-winded way of explaining how I kind of got to this point.
Yeah, there's a couple of threads I want to pick up on that, actually, quite a few that I think would be interesting. One, the white helmets. I mean, what an incredible just story or just the work they've done. They're quite infamous and famous, I would say, because of all the good work that they've done in really difficult and just horrible circumstances. I vaguely recall, I mean, there was a Netflix movie, I believe, watching. I mean, they're
Couple.
couple. Yeah. Tell me about that experience. I mean, it's one thing to hear about them and see all the, sort of media created around them, but to be in that position you were in, that must have been just an extraordinary experience and very unique.
Yeah, the way that it happened was actually I was working for an NGO that their main area of focus is to work with militaries and even with non-state actors to reduce civilian casualties in times of war. So almost an acknowledgement that casualties and civilian harm happen, but how can we mitigate it? How can we compensate or amend for it? Syria was complicated because the actors that were perpetrating the vast majority of civilian harm, the Syrian regime, ISIS, these actors, uh, civilian harm was part of the strategy. So it was very difficult to talk to them. But when I was on the ground, I kept talking to people about how do you keep yourself safe? Who do you call? Who can you trust? The white helmets came up over and over again. So I developed a report on civilian self-protection strategies. What can civilians do to protect themselves in times of war? And that sort of organically led to working with the white helmets. And what was interesting there, and I think that this is kind of an issue for everyone in this field, is that they're known for, the reaction, right? Like how do we protect people, was kind of the thing that was their bread and butter, but it was the search and rescue that we all know of and, is what the Netflix documentaries are about. But because they were so trusted in society, they were being looked at for, pandemic response when COVID hit and for a lot of the prevention and response to flooding that we were seeing in the camps and things like that. So I was definitely starting to bring in a lot of my disaster risk reduction sort of background into that work. And now, interestingly, Rad Saleh, who is the head of the White Helmets, is now part of a ministry that does do response, but because there isn't, thankfully, daily bombardment of civilian populations, how do we deal with some of these, water security issues and other things that affect people, every day? And that's it's less life-threatening on a daily basis for them, certainly, but it is no less difficult to get people's attention with regards to those issues, as you probably well know. Reaction is a lot easier than prevention, and unfortunately, I think we've been seeing the consequences of that in the region for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the shift from sort of crisis response, right? Which is you do the thing you can do quickest and most that's accessible and just kind of do any good, right? That's if things are so dire versus this longer term slow burn of kind of rebuilding and putting a society and infrastructure and all that back together. That you're right, that is harder. Um, in terms of comparison, just addressing an emergency as best you can is still a response. Um, I want to pivot a little bit from that. You mentioned Jordan, which is, as you had stated, a country and obviously a region that is afflicted with water scarcity and water security issues. And Jordan's in a tough spot in terms of the water security side of things, especially considering both in terms of water use and water supply. Right, water supply is constrained to a certain extent because of just the geography and limitation of surface water systems as it pertains to the Jordan River, but then also the issue of water loss. And I recall when you were during your time with CSIS, you published this really excellent report that if I remember correctly, had a more of a regional focus, but sort of this intersection of water security challenges in the region, but also connected to climate. I mean, you can't untether those two things, much like, as you mentioned earlier, when it comes to humanitarian crisis and water, which there's connection there that we can dive in a little bit later. But how do you assess just picking on Jordan for a second because it's such a unique and interesting case study of the water challenges there. What's your assessment of maybe for the benefit of our audience, sort of a snapshot of the challenge, the unique challenge there, and what are the pathways? Because I struggle specifically with the case of Jordan, much like many other countries in the region, each have their own challenges, but that's a tough one to me, and I still struggle wrap my head around what's a really feasible way forward, considering the water loss that occurs, high amount of water loss that occurs, and the limitation in accessible water supply.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about Jordan's water insecurity makes my hands clammy.
Mhm.
Even if we look into the future, there's a couple of projects huge projects that would be developed to kind of close the water deficit. Even with those, Jordan will likely run back into a deficit by 2035, which is not that far away. So it's unique in terms of geography. So it is a desert landscape. About 80% of the country is considered the Badia, or what we would say is like about 200 milliliters of rainwater per year or less. In many cases, much less. It is surrounded on all sides by countries primarily that don't want to help it very much. I mean, Israel has at various periods in time cut off water to Jordan. At times, Syria, for its own reason, for its own domestic reasons, but also sometimes to punish Israel further downstream, has also been reluctant to release water. And now, you have this underground aquifer that's shared between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is sort of is pumping from that aquifer at a very rapid rate. So it is, it's a country that's sort of on the fault lines in many ways. And on top of all of those things, it is not a rich country. So we're not talking about one of the oil-rich Gulf countries that can sort of desalinate their way to water security. There is a major project underway or potentially underway for desalination, but it is going to, I mean, to be frank, impoverish the country. It is extremely expensive. It has to be delivered essentially uphill from the south of the country to the north, where the vast majority of the population is in places in the capital Amman.
Yeah.
So, just an incredible amount of challenges. And I haven't even gotten into sort of the water quality issues, which are considerable in Jordan. I can tell you that me, my relatives, we have gotten sick increasingly as you know the years have gone on, sort of anecdotally, and there's some evidence of that as well. And it's it's really just on a tightrope, is the best way to describe that. And then at the same time, and just this is just zooming out geopolitically a bit, you have a government that has essentially been propped up. I mean, I hate to say it, but by external funding. So you have a situation where the government has not been popular, has not been great at delivering on services for a long time. And in order to sort of compensate the population, basic services have been artificially cheap. And first and foremost among them has been water, especially water for agricultural use. And so, because there's all these external actors like the US government that want to keep Jordan stable for a variety of reasons, Jordan will reach the point of reforms and then kind of, not to, no pun intended, water down those reforms. And so we don't see any real progress when it comes to things like non-revenue water, which is basically the water that either leaks or it's stolen before anyone can charge for it, essentially. And you still have a lot of you have people growing citrus in Jordan, and you still have people growing bananas in Jordan. You have a few farms in the south, which is in the middle of the desert. I mean, like the real desert. We're not talking about desertified desert. We're saying this has been desert for hundreds and hundreds of years. And those things should not be happening. That said, Jordan is trying. I mean, I think there's a few things that Jordan has done that other countries have not done. And again, this is primarily because of the external support that it receives. But things like treating and reusing wastewater, which all of the countries in the region should be doing, these kinds of things have really, I think, helped. But Jordan needs all of it. It needs to work on demand. It needs to work on supply. And even then, it's gonna be a struggle. So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating one, but I think it's kind of a microcosm of this overall issue, especially in this region, that you have a resource like water, which is essential to everybody. The infrastructure to, distribute it, to treat it, to distribute it is extremely expensive, and it's essentially free or very cheap. So those combination of factors are really already very tenuous. And then you add to all of that the fact that it is a very rare supply, an increasingly rare supply in the region. So it's definitely feels like walking on a tightrope for sure.
Yeah, and again, not to pick on Jordan, many of the countries in the region have issues on a similar axis, but Jordan is it to me, I find it an interesting case study because of all the things that you've mentioned. Kind of tangential to that, and maybe not so much in Jordan, but this kind of links back to some of your humanitarian work, and I know this was certainly the case in Syria. That has troubled me for a long time, going to the water quality point that you made earlier, of sort of this recurrence of waterborne illnesses that sort of proliferated, and part of it you can understand, right? In areas of conflict, if there is no access to water, you kind of get it where you can, and in some cases it's surface streams and rivers and systems, but people drink from there, and that water source needs to be treated before consumption, and so has that sort of reared its head in some of your previous work, and what's your perspective on that? I mean, uh, the limitation, of course, is again, cost is a wall to a lot of the solutions and strategies here, and some of those places are rural, right? So they may not have the sort of transmission system or networks to deliver treated water. Certainly, maybe not by pipelines, and otherwise by trucked water is an option, but then that becomes expensive. So what's your thought on that, and what's the outlook of that? And I see particularly in sort of the Levant countries.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's drinking from streams anymore anywhere in these places. And I mean, just anecdotally speaking, and I don't know if you can speak to this from your background, but I mean, when I was living, I lived in Syria a couple of different times. I remember in 2003, even in 2010, I would say people could drink from the tap. I mean, it was risky, but like Syrians were very proud of their water. This was not the case in Jordan. Nobody's been drinking from the tap for a very long time. Um, we can get into the reasons why there's sort of allotments issues that kind of create bacteria in the pipes and things like that. But Syrians were very proud of it. The vast majority of these waterborne illnesses are happening because of agriculture. So, in places like Syria, especially during the conflict, but even beforehand, I would say you would actually have farmers just breaking open sewage pipes and using them. So forget about wastewater treatment. They were desperate for any kind of moisture for their crops, and that will then lead to waterborne illnesses when people try to eat vegetables and things like that grown from there, and that kind of creates a vicious cycle. So the more people realize, when they eat baqdones, when they have like parsley, if they have, tabbouleh, or they have, lettuce or something like that, and then they get sick, which happens often, um, they don't believe, like when the government comes to them and says, we're going to do a wastewater treatment project, right? And then reuse it for agriculture. I mean, typically those should not be used on things like lettuce and things that are close to the ground. It should be for trees and things like that. But it makes people very apprehensive about that because they have the lived experience of getting sick from that kind of thing, let alone farmers that think that, this is going to degrade their land and the land value. So it does create kind of a like a vicious cycle. Now, when you're looking at a conflict, I mean, these are already countries that, I mean, Jordan is actually sort of, I can single it out a little bit because it's done much better with wastewater treatment and reuse. But a country like Iraq, for example, that is energy rich, should be doing a lot of wastewater treatment and reuse, especially given its water quality issues and its water supply issues. And there's really no secondary treatment of wastewater anywhere in the country. So no actual treatment of wastewater, which is astounding. And so, I mean, there almost sometimes, in some cases, there isn't infrastructure to degrade or destroy in the first place. But then when we look at this, Iraq was a country that's been emerging from, years of war and years of sanctions before that. So, there's a history here. And if we go to Gaza, which has been, completely decimated is not even the right word because it's more than decimated. 80% of the water and sanitation infrastructure has been totally destroyed. This was a country that was already on the brink because of years of siege and inability to create desalination plants, water treatment plants, etc. And all of the water in Gaza needs to be treated. So we're seeing just catastrophic rates of waterborne illnesses there because Israel won't let in any of the supplies even to maintain or rehabilitate this sort of water treatment infrastructure, water supply infrastructure. So it's really devastating. We just sort of see a magnification of these effects. And then when we see a post-conflict environment, I mean, I hate using the word post-conflict because, like I said, I think it tends to be ongoing for a long time, all of the consequences of conflicts and sanctions. But if we look at a place like Syria, there's been a lot of focus on private sector investment and things like that. That's fine, but that's probably not going to resolve the water and sanitation issues because, again, all of these things are relatively free. And so, your average private investor is probably not going to immediately want to rebuild water and sanitation infrastructure. So it can go by the wayside in ways that are, really devastating, I think, to public health, and for food security, over the long term, of course, too. So it's challenging. And you mentioned water trucking, which of course we've seen an increasing amount of, throughout the region. In some cases, especially during the crisis, the economic crisis in Lebanon, not even the one that we're talking about today, the one in 2019, there were households spending 30% of their income on water trucks.
Insane.
Because again, you can't drink the water coming out of the faucets in Lebanon. Haven't been able to for a very long time.
Yeah, it blows my mind the comment you made of just as you say, post conflict, as we'll call it that, just the reluctance to invest in water infrastructure, which is one of the most fundamental building blocks of a society that should be prioritized, but it isn't, as you said, which is really 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 unfortunate. I think that exacerbates the sort of the shadow of the effects of conflict, if it is not addressed. I'm glad you took us where you took us because I want to chat about the current state of the region, which is unfortunately quite depressing in many ways, but both on sort of the geopolitical context, but not on its own. But obviously, the geopolitical context is what sets the conversation on the impact as it goes to water security and all the things connected to having water reliability in the region. Obviously, many things are happening. Conflict in Gaza, bleeding over into Lebanon, what's happening in the Gulf states and the Gulf itself, and not to ignore other issues that have long continued, the war in Sudan, what's going on in Yemen. The question I wanted to ask, which would be the easy yes or no question, which is like, how bad is it? It's pretty bad. But if you could add sort of some nuance in sort of that connection between sort of the geopolitical status that is in the region, happening across the region, and how that is sort of bled over into the water issues that the region is facing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Mohammed, we've been talking about this piece of it for a long time, right? I think it's always been challenging to get people to focus on climate change or water security, especially in this region, because there's always another crisis that's overshadowing the longer term crises that are ongoing. I mean, before this happened, Iran was talking about needing to relocate its capital because of water crisis in Tehran, which is a city of 10 million people, just Tehran, right? We were talking about Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and how it was about to, reach zero water day, and it would also have to be eventually relocated somewhere else. So, I mean, these are not small questions to be asking, relocating historic population centers in capital cities because of water insecurity. And like I said, in Lebanon, it's been a water crisis for a very long time. I mean, basically, salt water is coming out of people's taps. Gaza has been on the verge of the coastal aquifer just completely collapsing for a very long time. And now we have to, it was actually progressing fairly well because some wastewater treatment plants were built running on solar. And so we were actually seeing decreasing nitrate levels in the groundwater. I mean, that's all over now with this conflict. So it's really challenging because we've been talking about these issues for a very long time. In order to address them, we really need to have some level of stability to be able to do so. And so just the fact that we have to keep, regressing, in the case of Gaza by 77 years by some estimates, is really, I mean, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but it's incredibly depressing, right? Because when the conflicts end, if they end, we're not going back to square one or like a really positive place. We're getting back to the existential challenges that all of these populations were facing to begin with, right? I mean, I think the Gulf countries, the oil-rich Gulf countries, Doha and, Qatar and all of these places, they have the sovereign wealth funds, I think, to bounce back from this. But at the same time, their model is based on stability. right? If they, if 90% or more of their drinking water supply is threatened, or energy infrastructure is threatened, or et cetera, et cetera, I could go on and on, ports, that, severely limits the model. And so I think, I hope that if anything, this kind of creates a reawakening of the vulnerabilities and the consequences of conflict so that we don't return to it so easily. I mean, I would open this question up to you. I don't know if I'm seeing that yet. Certainly, there are some Gulf states that are being much more diplomatic, I think, because they don't want this to happen anymore. But it's not clear to me, at least on the US side, that there is an acknowledgement that laying waste to these areas over and over again doesn't carry with it long-term consequences that we all have to deal with, not just the most vulnerable on the ground. I just don't see that realization, that nuance in the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what we're learning, if we didn't know already, is how interconnected everything is in terms of, sort of the global system as it comes to energy and food and water and manufacturing. And we're all, to a certain extent, feeling the effects of certainly what's happening in the Gulf because of just how ingrained sort of the energy and fuel that that region produces feeds into economic systems around the world. And to your earlier point, this conflict is shattering that illusion of stability, which then affects that their manufacturing ability in terms of producing petroleum and so forth that other most of the world is relying on, and shakes the foundation of global economic stability. Um, I kind of want to. It is all depressing, but I kind of want to take us to somewhere a little bit more positive, to hopefully balance all of this negativity surrounding us. Unfortunately, it's the reality. It's not that is not manufactured. That is unfortunately real. But what is your looking back at all of these areas and topics and things that you work on, continue to work on, and have been involved in? What's sort of the silver lining there for you? What motivates you? What is the thing that, it's difficult work, it's challenging work, but something makes you do it? I can guess what the answer would be, but I want to hear your personal perspective on, because I imagine I think that comes from a place of wanting to achieve some level of positivity and good. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So please tell me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Syrian playwright. He passed away a few years ago, but there's a famous quote in a speech of his that says, "We are condemned to hope." And I think that's where we're at. I mean, you and I are from the region. I don't think it's sort of an option for us to despair too much. So there's that. There's the aspect of like daily survival of the people that we know and love. And then I think beyond that, my hope stems from different places depending on where I'm at. So, working with the White Helmets, working on the ground with humanitarian organizations or with refugees, it is and I don't want to use the term resilience, it's more the care that people show for each other in the worst of circumstances. Some of the most brilliant water engineers that I've ever met have come out of like places like Jordan and Palestine. There are people there that want to do good work. Some of the most amazing entrepreneurs that are trying to work on these issues from a more creative lens have come from Lebanon, and they've developed incredible sort of waste management, wastewater management ideas. We're seeing solar spread really rapidly through these areas simply because they need to, right? They need to sort of rely on themselves. And so, that gives me hope when I'm working on the ground more. Here, back in DC, where it's maybe even harder to find hope, is I think, once again, I don't know how many cycles we have to go through this, but I think an acknowledgement amongst Americans that this is not a great idea. That paying, 4.60 right now at the gallon in my area, it's hard to understand what that's all for. I think our media landscape, even as it becomes more compromised in certain aspects, it's also becoming more democratized in other aspects. We're not relying on a foreign war correspondent to go to an area and his one clip or picture of the situation. We can talk to people from these places to assess how really horrifying these situations are, right? And I just hope that that makes its way into a larger, audience. Because, at the end of the day, even if we're paying more for gas at the pump, we're not feeling it as much as, people in Lebanon, people in Gaza, I would say people in Bangladesh. I mean, in parts of South Asia where they've had to sort of shut down hospitals and schools because of a lot of these global supply chain issues. We are one of the biggest energy producers in the world. And, so we're not going to feel it as much. But I think if we can see it, we are seeing opinions shift gradually in the United States to a point that I never would have believed, to be honest, when I started my career. So that gives me hope every day.
Good. Yeah, it's uh, we have to hope, right? I mean, I think humans, people generally can be resilient, and certainly the examples we talked about in the region, having to be resilient out of necessity because the alternative is nothing, really. Um, but to your point on current issues, it helps sort of being resilient if there is cause for it. And I feel at least, in this part of the world that we're in right now in North America that or in the US, uh, the reason is not there, right? It's a survival, resilience out of survival, but another option was possible that we wouldn't be in this scenario. So that's challenging, I think. We're winding down. I have a penultimate question. I have another question to end with, but I have a penultimate question that just occurred to me that I think could provide another hopeful response, which again to balance out the episode, if you will. All of it's been great. All of it's been great, of course, but I think you and I are in a very unique intersection of topics and themes. Uh, and correct me if you feel differently, but this is my perspective, at least for myself. And I think you're in a similar boat, which is another water pun. I can't help it. Which is, I think we're both sort of, to a certain extent, water people that are operating in sort of the climate adaptation world, but doing so from sort of a policy angle that, obviously you can't avoid the geopolitical aspects of that. I try to avoid it as much as I can because I'm very uncomfortable with it because that's not where my career started, but I recognize it's unavoidable. And then all of that in the context of the Middle East. Those are very sort of niche areas that have combined together. Um, so I ask myself this question, folks have sort of asked this question of how is it to operate in such a space that is it's a thin slice of all of those things, but now mushed together to make this really awkward looking cake. What are sort of some of the challenges or benefits of being, I mean, I can see benefits, of course, of being sort of that unique space and across all of those, segments. What's your perspective of operating that space? Again, assuming you agree with me, you completely disagree, but I kind of view you in that same vein.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's an uncomfortable space for a lot of people. Just speaking from the perspective of my father, who was working for the Environmental Protection Agency, I remember him coming home during the Reagan years, and that was tough. He was working domestically on water issues, but, constantly juxtaposed with people operating from the policy space and him as a scientist basically saying the science doesn't say that though. And I think that kind of says it all. It's a very uncomfortable intersection for a lot of people. And to bring the point home, when I had this water security project at CSIS, one of our board members, Claudia Sadoff, part of the board of advisors. This is a woman who's been working on water security, food security for decades and decades, World Bank, CGR, et cetera. And, I told her, I was like, maybe I should go back to school and get sort of the heart, do the water engineering part of it. And I was actually surprised by her answer because she said, no, we need more people who understand the politics of this because a lot of these are not technical problems. We have the technical solutions. It is a political problem. And I think that, throughout our careers, and I'm not going to ask you how old you are, but I remember, sort of at the beginning, there was a lot of there was this period primarily led by Egyptians, I think, at the World Bank, saying, the next conflicts will be about water. But then that sort of engendered this era in the early 2000s of, water is going to lead to peace because everybody needs it. And, this very kumbaya kind of aspect of it, which I didn't know where it was coming from really because I had been operating in this environment, between Syria and Turkey and, et cetera, where there had been wars going on for a very long time with water as an issue flowing through, as it were. And so I think we're much more understanding of how all of these things are interlinked, right? That the Palestinians are not going to be able to achieve water security because of a technical solution, right? And it might help, it might be a band-aid, but it's not going to help the overall situation. And I think that there's more of an acknowledgement there. And much like AA members, maybe acknowledging that you have a problem is the first step towards toward, towards resolving it, right? I think you do have to admit that you have a problem. And so I know that there's a lot of people in the water world that will continue to argue that we need to focus on peace, but I think a lot of that was based off of water treaties that existed for Northern Europe, for example. A lot of the statistics about how all of these different peace agreements and things like that, or treaties related to water, were very geographically concentrated. And I think what we're seeing in South Asia, in the Middle East, and other parts of the world, in Africa, there's good examples, but there's a lot of things that are kind of falling apart. And I think and this kind of actually leads back to my humanitarian background as well, that humanitarian aid is not going to solve everything, right? If you have, political issues that are obstructing that aid, not letting it lead to its full, level of efficiency, usually because of politics, you're going to run into the same problem. So I do think, there's a value to trying to desecuritize water to a certain degree. But I don't think we should just put rose-colored glasses on. And maybe to end on a very, like an actual happy note, at least from my perspective, Syria. I mean, we talked about all of the bad things happening in Syria today, but the reality is the hope is there now. Like I can see my friends that haven't been back to their country in 10 years or more, and we can talk about these problems. And back in 2010 we couldn't do that, and ever since then we couldn't do that. So, just being able to talk about these things is, again, I think one step towards getting somewhere more positive. And we're there in Syria. The money needs to come, but I think the first step is being able to talk about these issues like we're doing right now.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like to pull on your metaphor, it's a happy intervention. It
Yeah.
it's a AA meeting, but it's, water WA Waters Anonymous or something. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I couldn't agree more with the notion that you said that. there are technical people, right, that do this work, and there are political people that understand sort of the non-technical human element of the issue. But I think to your point where we could add value is that bridge in between. Because you need people that they don't have to be specialists or extreme specialists in each of those camps, but they need to be able to speak the language of both. And I think that's certainly an area where I feel could add value. I used to joke with some of my former scholars. I'd say we're science whisperers. All of us have these technical backgrounds, but we're operating in a mostly non-technical space. And that's where you add value. You need people that can bridge that gap. It can be uncomfortable, especially if I think coming from the technical side, you're more uncomfortable with the sort of the political angle. It was interesting to hear you say the opposite, right? Looking at it from the other side. Uh, so I guess maybe we all have a level of discomfort, but that's needed, and I'm glad to hear that you know that space exists, and there's people like us that are hopefully trying to help bridge that gap. Okay, final real question. Sort of we end the episode on sort of giving our guests opportunity to talk about what they're doing in terms of their work, specifically if there's a project, something that was recently completed, you're in the midst of some type of engagement or activity, or something that's coming down the pipeline, maybe a public appearance or whatever the case may be that you feel you're willing to share, noting that this, I like to say, think of it in timelines of weeks and months because these episodes don't always land right after we record them. But anything you want to share that folks can find on some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a lot of my published work is sadly probably still relevant from CSIS. You spoke about one of the pieces, which is not just me, but five other amazing authors, really looking in depth at specific, actually subnational areas around the region, around the Middle East, I should say. But we also have an amazing digital report up on CSIS's website related to water and security, and basically how we got to this point. I think it's a good explainer, aesthetically pleasing explainer with regards to water security in the Middle East in particular. But looking down the pike, I mean, most of my work, to be honest, in the past year has been on Gaza and on Syria. And Gaza, for many reasons, we just published a scorecard on the so-called ceasefire, and a big hefty proportion of that is water and sanitation issues, which are really devastating in Gaza, and how we're really going to deal with that. And so that really looks at the conflict aspect of that, given all of the obstructions that currently exist. And then on Syria, I think more on the hopeful side, as I was mentioning, we're looking at a project that delves into the challenges faced by returnees. So people that want to return to their homes, whether or not they were internally displaced in Syria, or coming from outside of the country. And it's really all about reestablishing livelihoods and basic services, and that to a large degree is agriculture, which is very heavily dependent on water, obviously, and then just water and sanitation infrastructure. It's going to be a big issue because, as I mentioned, I think what I find fascinating about water more generally is that it's just this conundrum, that it's this thing that's extremely expensive to produce, and yet vital for all of us, right? For human life. And so, how is Syria going to deal with that in this world where we have very little to aid to count on? It's the kind of country that probably needs some kind of Marshall Plan, but that Marshall Plan is not coming. So excited to talk to you more about that in the next few months, and anyone who's online who's interested in, sort of grappling with those problems. But yeah, those are the things that we've been working on.
Amazing, amazing. Natasha, always love chatting with you. You are a fountain of knowledge and experience, and I really am really happy you're able to join with us today. So thank you all for tuning in. Please continue to follow Climate and Water Initiative, and we'll see you at our next episode. Thank you.